My dad told me I'd never make money as an artist. Last month, he called asking if I could cover his mortgage. They used to say it with a laugh like a weather report. Sure, I'd be an artist. If that's what makes you happy, Dad would say, patting my shoulder with the same patronizing smile he used when he handed me a lawn mower at 13 and told me to earn my keep. It was always couched in a joke. Underneath the jabs was the ledger. Numbers that added up to his idea of responsibility and my idea, paint-stained, loud, stubborn, never fit. This is the story of how I answered that call. It's also the story of stubbornness, of small betrayals that change how you see home, and of a slow, ridiculous, improbable climb from being the family joke to the only person my father trusted enough to call when his back was against the wall. I grew up in a split-level house in suburban Ohio with a lawn so perfect Dad would say it had curb appeal. He ran his small construction company out of a corner office that smelled like sawdust and coffee. He believed in things that could be measured, blueprints, profit margins, schedules. The world to him had right angles and deadlines. Art, he said, didn't pay the mortgage. I learned the tools, not brushes, but the tools Dad revered. Wrench, tape measure, heavy-handed metaphors about building something that lasts. I wasn't bad with those things. I could assemble a bookshelf, patch drywall. But my hands always wanted a different rhythm. Soft strokes, bleeding pigment, the way light sits on the rim of an oil can. When I was 14, I took the cheapest oil set I could find and painted the rusted Mustang in Dad's garage, until my fingers smelled of turpentine for days. It felt like prayer. You're talented, Mom would say, smoothing a napkin over my half-finished canvas at the kitchen table, but talent doesn't pay the bills. Mom meant well. She had read financial advisories and put them in the helpful pile beside casserole recipes. Dad would add, you'll be happier with a steady job. He said it with the same softness people use when breaking bad news. I know it hurts now, but you'll thank me later. At 23, I left for art school on a scholarship I scraped together with part-time jobs and a portfolio that made my high school teacher cry. Out of pride, she swore. Art school felt like immersion. Professors who smelled like tobacco and paint, long nights in studio, mouths stained with the cheap coffee we drank while we argued about composition. I learned to see things in layers. I learned that if I painted long enough, the ache in my chest would rearrange itself into color. But graduation is its own kind of bruise. The economy was stubbornly flat. Galleries wanted names with careers, collectors wanted names with pedigrees. I did shows in basements, in pop-up co-ops, in the back of cafes that happened to have a landlord who liked local culture. I did commissions for friends whose parents were doctors and lawyers, and had no idea what to do with the sentiment of a $250 portrait. I taught nights at a community center to pay rent and bought decent brushes only when I convinced myself it was an investment, not indulgence. Dad's text messages were the same sugar-slick concern. When are you going to get serious about real work? He loved me. He just didn't love the idea I had of a life. The fights grew quieter over the years. Silence can be as efficient as a hammer. When Mom suggested I get a real job after a lukewarm review at a local gallery, Dad's pitying smile hardened into a rule. We'll help you for a year. After that, you have to decide. I decided to stay. I decided to try to make painting a living. If you've ever planted a garden, you know the world rewards patience. If you're an artist, you learn to be patient with people who don't know how to ask for what they need. My first real break was a ridiculously small, wildly consequential thing. An intersection of timing, kindness, and the internet. A boutique hotel in downtown Columbus wanted local artists to hang work in their new lobby. They offered a small stipend, barely enough for supplies but exposure. I delivered 6 canvases of cityscapes at dawn and met the general manager, a woman named Aria who had a laugh like a bell. She loved them. A week later, she asked if I could do a mural in the adjacent cafe. I said yes before I calculated how long it would take. I painted the mural in 3 sessions over a weekend. It was a blue, absurd skyline with a crooked Ferris wheel and a tiny dog stealing a pretzel. Someone posted a photo of it on Instagram with a caption about finding beauty in small places. The post got shared. A local food blogger wrote about the cafe's ambience and mentioned the mural. A small art blog picked it up. Within a month, a boutique interior designer from Cleveland called asking if I would travel to paint a mural in a private residence. That job paid better than anything I'd done up to that point. The designer introduced me to other clients. Someone commissioned me to paint a series inspired by their childhood home. The projects didn't pay in yachts or luxury, but they paid. Slowly, the ledger of my life began to change. I rented a tiny studio above a florist and painted with the windows open in summer. I learned to price my work not like a starving poet, but with a contractor's sense of margins. Materials, time, overhead, and yes, profit. I taught a couple of weekend workshops. I started selling small prints online. I learned taxes, learned contracts, learned how to say no to a commission that would be creatively deadening, even if it paid well. Then 3 years into this odd career, a museum curator from Cincinnati emailed me. She'd seen a piece of mine in a design magazine and wanted me for a group show about new regionalists. The opening night had wine and small talk, and another curator from a different museum showed up. She introduced herself as Lena and said she was organizing a traveling show for emerging Midwestern artists. Could I submit? I spent the next month painting as if the paint would teach me how to live. I submitted. They accepted 3 pieces. The show toured to 3 cities. Each opening brought new people, one of whom was a private collector who liked the way I painted sky and said simply, "We'll take that one." That collector later referred a buyer in New York. 1 referral became 2, 2 became a trickle. The trickle, after a few years, became a steady stream. I learned that success for an artist often looks like 1,000 tiny yesies. There were small humiliations along the way. My parents still told me at holidays about friends whose kids had bought condos and cars, and how unsustainable careers did not look good on a LinkedIn profile. Once at a barbecue, Dad announced to the circle of neighbors that I was doing art and followed it with a joke. If she ever needs help paying power at her place, I'll give her a list of HVAC guys. The neighbors laughed. I smiled. There is a particular ache when your success is also a public spectacle for other people to comment on. But I kept painting. I kept getting shows. By 33, I had a solo show in a small but respected gallery in Detroit. It sold modestly, but one of the pieces caught the attention of a writer at a national paper who ran a feature on Midwestern artists to watch. My website traffic tripled. The calls started coming from cities I'd only visited in years when I drove until the odometer read new numbers and slept in motels. Then the thing every artist half threatens and half prays for, a piece of mine, went viral. It wasn't the biggest piece I'd ever made. It was a small painting of a laundromat at midnight lit like a stage. Someone reposted it with a personal essay about small-town dignity, and the internet did what the internet does now. It leveled it up and made it loud. Orders followed. Galleries from other states asked to represent me. A higher-profile gallery in Chicago offered a commission and a slot in a group show. Money isn't everything, but suddenly I had more than enough. I paid off the debt I'd accumulated during lean years, refinanced my studio lease into a longer-term space I could paint in daylight, and put cash aside for a real emergency fund. I still ate ramen sometimes because cheap is efficiency, not tragedy. But the ledger had more green now. On the Friday before Thanksgiving, a detail my father loved to bring up later, I called home. Dad answered on the 3rd ring, surprised I was calling on a weekday. So I said, "I've got news." He made the predictable dad joke, "Don't tell me you finally decided to get a job with a 401k, but the tone had a crack of something else beneath it, curiosity. When I told him about the Chicago show and the commission, his voice went quiet. He made a joke about finally getting a salary that'll pay for your mom's plants. The laughter tasted different that night, it had edges. We didn't get past small talk. My success was still a story with a footnote in their world. It didn't quite change the ledger they'd long balanced carefully against their understanding of me. Fast forward 3 years. I had a manager now, an actual person who handled logistics and negotiations and reminded me to save for taxes. I had limits. I turned down certain commissions, kept some prices modest for accessibility, and cultivated a small circle of collectors who supported my work. Life settled into what felt like a hard-won rhythm. The call came on a Sunday in early spring. The phone number was my father's. When I saw it flash, something cold walked through me. We'd been speaking more, awkward apologies and small attempts at connection after my shows, reciprocal gifts that were mostly silence. I answered. "Hi, kiddo," Dad said. Then after a pause, can you help me out? I'm behind on the mortgage." The sentence landed the way thunder does in a clear sky. I didn't respond at first. I could hear the laundry room hum in the background, some small life noise keeping time. What? I said finally. It's the business, he said. Materials are up, jobs are thin, I miscalculated a contract, we're short, the bank is calling. I didn't want to involve you, but would you be able to cover 2 months of the mortgage? I can pay you back, I will pay you back. 2 months. He gave me a number smaller than my rent in the city, but large enough to mean something significant. He was asking me, the artist, the one he'd always thought of as fragile as a ceramic dish, to hold up a ledger he'd spent a life building. Sitting in my studio, the tile cool beneath my bare feet, I felt a dozen answers line up like possible paintings. Anger, a sting of the old dismissal, the memory of barbecues and jokes. My chest clenched with years of small, accumulated humiliations. Dad, I said, how bad? He explained the contract had been with a municipal client who'd delayed payment. A subcontractor had gone bankrupt. Prices of lumber and siding had spiked. It was a story of math and bad luck, but underneath I could hear the same thing he always said, responsibility. Pride. Part of me wanted to say no outright, to let the ledger be the ledger. But then I thought of the small, human things, the cough in his voice that came with being 59 and running a crew. The way he always fixed my hood with the gentleness of someone who'd once told me he'd be there. The way Mom's laugh had changed since they cut back hours at the practice. Small alarms that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with the fact that a person you love is breathing under a weight. I also thought about how often, as an artist, I'd been asked, by friends, strangers, a panelist at a grant, to consider my financial responsibility as a community member. Art, for all its frills, sometimes asks for shelter too. I can't help, I said. Dad breathed out on the other end like someone who's been holding water under his nose. Thank you, he said. I'll wire it back in 6 weeks, I promise. I arranged the transfer. I felt 100 things, the relief that came like a warm blanket and a low, hard hum of consequences. That night I dreamed of painting over a blueprint with watercolor until the lines blurred. I paid the mortgage. I sent the transfer and left a message. Dad, I did what I could, we'll talk terms later. We did talk, but not in the way Dad expected. I wanted clarity. The money wasn't charity in my mind. It wasn't a lifeline to be taken and then forgotten. It was a loan between two adults, with terms laid out plainly because art and contract and construction both answer well to clarity. He bristled at first, we're family, that old very American shield, but I persisted, documentation. A simple note, a schedule. It wasn't mistrust, it was how I ran my life now. He accepted. He wrote a check to my account for half of it a month later, as he promised, and the rest when his receivable came through. He kept his word. That should have been the end. Instead, that small pause, the one between the transfer and our arrangement, became a hinge. Because helping didn't erase the past. It complicated it. It made me see Dad differently, not just as a man who once said art wouldn't pay, but as someone who, in his pride and his mistakes, still had a quiet muscle of shame. He had called me. He had trusted me. That trust made him vulnerable in a way he rarely was. It also gave me power, the kind that humbles, not the kind that raises you on a pedestal. In the months that followed, our relationship rewrote itself slowly. Dad started showing up at my shows with the careful, baffled pride of someone who doesn't quite know the names of the people applauding, but wants to be part of the sound. He asked questions that were no longer jokes. How long did that take? Who buys these? He listened. Once at my opening in Chicago, he stood at the back of the crowd and cried quietly in a coat that smelled like oil and cedar. I noticed, which meant he'd wanted me to see, which meant he was changing. There were other things. He started delegating jobs more responsibly. He hired a business manager for his construction company, something he'd always swatted away as unnecessary fuss. He paid attention to cash flow. He learned to accept help without that old defensive posturing. He did not become humble overnight. But the small adjustments stuck. Triumph in my life never looked like an explosion of fame. It looked like a slow reassignment of meaning. Neighbors who once laughed now asked, "What are you showing this time?" People who'd once dismissed me as a hobbyist started to commission work. My income stabilized, not extravagantly but enough for a decent studio, a savings account that felt adult, vacations that were more than car camping. And Dad. He learned to ask in a different tone. One afternoon he came over with a sandwich wrapped in wax paper and a small, incredibly awkward present, a hand-carved wooden pallet he'd made himself. Thought you might like something legit, he said, avoiding my eyes. I opened it and found, tucked inside, a tiny brass plaque he'd hammered onto the corner. To Jenna, keep painting. It was not the kind of gift you buy at a gallery. It was a thing built in his workshop out of the things he trusted: wood, nails, patience. That mattered. The day I sold my first piece to a collector who'd commissioned a 3-part work for $12,000, a number massive to me then, I called Dad. Guess who's paying for their entire mortgage now, he joked, voice lighter. Don't flaunt it, I warned. We laughed like conspirators. Later that year, a documentary about Midwestern artists featured my studio. In the film, I speak about practice and persistence and how money is a tool, not a verdict. My father watched it quietly and afterward kissed Mom on the forehead and said, I should have listened. That's not a sentence you hear much. It lands like a small earthquake. Here's what I want to be honest about. None of this is a neat morality play. Helping Dad didn't wipe clean every old wound. There were times I resented him for a comment he made at a party. There were evenings I felt the old humiliation creep back, a ghost at the table. And sometimes, most painfully, I felt like a bank with feelings. He had called me because he was desperate. Desperation strips you of courtesy. It makes you ask things you promised yourself you never would. But I also learned that triumph is messy. It's not about hoarding dignity like a fine china set. It's about choosing how you spend it. I could have refused, and in some ways that may have felt righteous. Or I could accept the opportunity to be the kind of person I had wished someone would have been for me when I was sleeping on borrowed couches and working shifts until dawn. I paid the mortgage. I taught Dad to read invoices better than he ever had. He learned to ask for help sooner. He learned to admit mistakes. I learned to be both generous and firm. I learned that offering help does not mean forgetting boundaries. It means building them into the moment when you hand someone the ladder. A year after that first transfer, we sat on my studio roof in early summer with cans of cheap beer, watching the sunset warm our canvases and the city in the distance. Dad nudged me with his shoulder. You know, he said, the sentence shape taking its time, I was wrong about a lot of things. You were, I agreed. Not everything, he added quickly. You still can't cut your own hair. He pointed at my noisy fringe and laughed. We laughed back. We were both older, a little softer, and more honest than we'd been. The mortgage was long past, the company was steadier. Our ledger had changed, but so had our language. He didn't say, I told you so. He said, I'm proud, which landed strangely large. Triumph for me wasn't a billboard or a check so large it made people gasp. It was the new possibility of being known by someone who had once been a skeptic, and the ability to set terms for how help is given and received. It was the mutual care between two adults who had each been wrong in their own ways. And if on some afternoons, I still paint laundromats in small-town diners, because they tell the stories I prefer to tell, that's okay. Money never dictated what I painted, it just paid the rent while I painted the things that matter.